The thermostat read 68 degrees, but the living room felt like the inside of a furnace. Dominic Voss stood by the kitchen counter, arranging a platter of cheese and crackers with the careful attention of a man who needed something to do with his hands. 22 guests were scattered across the open-plan space, colleagues, neighbours, two couples they'd met at a winery in Napa 3 summers ago. The kind of gathering that looked effortless from the outside and cost a week's worth of anxiety to plan. His wife, Priya, moved through the room the way she always had at parties, fluid, magnetic, drawing laughter out of people like a magician pulling silk scarves from a hat. She wore the navy-wrapped dress he'd bought her for their 4th anniversary. Her hair was pinned up in that loose, slightly imperfect way she'd perfected over years of practice. She looked like herself. She looked fine. That was the part that frightened him most. Because for 6 weeks, 43 days, if he was being precise, and Dominic was always being precise, Priya had not been fine at all. It had started the way most quiet catastrophes do, with something almost too small to notice. A text notification at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. The screen lighting up on the nightstand while Priya slept beside him. He hadn't meant to look. He'd reached for a glass of water, and the angle of the screen put the sender's name directly in his line of sight. Eli. Just one name. No last name saved. No context. The preview cut off after 6 words. I still think about what you. He'd set the water glass down without drinking from it. He'd stared at the ceiling until 3 a.m. By morning, he'd convinced himself there were 100 innocent explanations for a message like that, and he'd chosen to believe every single one of them. That was the first mistake. Over the following weeks, the evidence assembled itself without his permission. Long showers that seemed to start right after her phone buzzed. A lunch with colleagues on a Saturday, which was odd, because Priya worked in academic research and her colleagues did not, as a rule, schedule Saturday lunches. A laugh he heard her stifle in the hallway outside their bedroom, the kind of laugh that gets quickly swallowed when someone realizes they're not alone. He'd said nothing. He'd been raised in a household where accusations without proof were considered a form of violence, and so he'd held his suspicions close and waited and told himself he was being patient when what he was actually being was terrified. The gathering tonight had been his idea, a last resort dressed up as a dinner party. He wanted to see her in their life, surrounded by their people, and feel normal again. He wanted proof in the other direction. He wanted to look at her face in the middle of their living room and think, I was imagining things. She's right here. She's always been right here. Dr. Sarah Okafor arrived first, the way she always did, clutching a bottle of red wine and wearing the expression of someone who'd already had an interesting day and was ready to share it. She was Dominic's closest friend from graduate school, a neuroscientist with a loud laugh and an uncanny ability to read rooms. She kissed Priya on the cheek, pressed the wine into Dominic's hands, and leaned close to whisper, You look like a man who hasn't slept in a month. 14 days, he said. She studied him for a moment. We'll talk later. They didn't get the chance. The rest of the guests filtered in over the next 30 minutes. There was Zara and her husband, Marcus, both architects, both catastrophically good-looking in that effortless way that made Dominic feel slightly underdressed in his own home. There was Chen Wei, Priya's former PhD supervisor, who had brought his partner Reed, a documentary filmmaker with a perpetual camera slung around his neck and a habit of narrating his own observations out loud. There were neighbours, acquaintances, a few faces Dominic recognized without being able to attach names to. And then there was Naira. Dominic had not expected Naira. She appeared in the doorway at 7:23 p.m., a full hour after the party had started, wearing a red jacket he recognized immediately because he'd seen it before, hanging in a photograph on Priya's old Instagram circa 6 years ago, from a trip to Lisbon that Priya had taken before they'd met. In the photograph, Priya and Naira were standing on a tiled rooftop at sunset, arms around each other, squinting into the light. He knew who Naira was. not personally, but he knew of her the way you know of someone who has been carefully edited out of a story, present in the margins, referenced occasionally, never centered. Priya had introduced them once years ago. "My oldest friend," she'd said, with that particular brightness people use when they're presenting something they want you to find uncomplicated. Dominic had found her perfectly uncomplicated at the time. Now he watched the two of them embrace near the entryway, and something cold settled behind his sternum. The party moved the way parties do, in currents and eddies, groups forming and dissolving, conversations layering over each other until the whole room became a kind of white noise that felt, paradoxically, like silence. Dominic poured drinks and laughed at things he didn't find funny, and watched his wife from across the room with the focused attention of a man trying to read a map in a foreign language. Sarah found him at the drinks table around 9 o'clock. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water and stood beside him without speaking for a moment, watching the room. "She's nervous," Sarah said finally. "Priya?" He kept his voice even. "I've known her almost as long as you have. She's performing." Sarah tilted her head slightly. "Who's the woman in the red jacket?" "Old friend," Dominic said. "Naira something. They go back to undergrad." Sarah said nothing, which, from Sarah, meant something. He was about to ask her what she was thinking when the argument started. He didn't see the beginning of it. He heard a shift in the room's temperature before he understood what was happening, a subtle drop in ambient noise, the way a crowd goes quiet when something real intrudes on the performance of normalcy. He turned from the drinks table to find Priya standing in the center of the living room, Naira 3 feet away from her, and the space between them charged with something that had clearly been building long before tonight. He didn't know what had been said before he turned around. He'd never know. Later, he tried to reconstruct it from fragments. Something about a phone call, something about a promise. Naira's voice low and tight in the particular way of someone trying to hold an argument below the surface and losing the battle. What he heard, clearly, was Priya's response. It came after a long pause, one of those silences that functions not as the absence of sound, but as its own statement. Priya stood with her shoulders squared and her chin lifted, and something in her expression that Dominic had never seen before, a kind of terrible exhaustion, the look of a person who has been holding a door shut for a very long time and has simply run out of strength. "Yes," Priya said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The room had already gone quiet enough that it carried to every corner. "Yes, I'm with my ex." 22 people stopped breathing at the same moment. Dominic heard the words enter him the way sound enters water, a disruption that moved outward from a central point, reaching every part of him before he'd finished processing what had hit him. With her ex. He had a name, Eli, from the text message, from 43 nights of ceiling staring, and now he had a confirmation delivered in a room full of people he knew, in a voice that sounded almost like relief. He set down the glass in his hand. He was aware of doing this with great precision, the way you focus on small mechanical tasks when the larger world has become briefly unlivable. He set it down on the marble surface of the drinks table, and he looked at his wife, and she was not looking at him. She was looking at Naira. The room was very, very quiet. And then Dominic walked to the coat rack near the front door, removed his jacket, and left. He didn't slam the door. He closed it softly behind him, which felt like the most devastating thing he could have done. The October air outside was cold and sharp enough to make his lungs work again. He walked without direction, down the front path, left onto the sidewalk, past the amber circles of streetlights and the parked cars and the neighbor's porch with its still-lit Halloween decorations. He walked until the sounds from the party had faded completely, and he could hear only his own footsteps, and, somewhere distant, a dog barking at something it couldn't identify. He sat on a bench at the edge of the small park, 2 blocks from their house. His phone buzzed continuously in his pocket. He watched it vibrate against his thigh and did not answer it. "I'm with my ex." He thought about the night they'd met, a departmental mixer at the university 7 years ago. She'd been presenting her research on linguistic displacement, and he'd spent 20 minutes pretending to be interested in a poster near hers just to stay in her orbit. He thought about the first year, the apartment with the broken radiator, learning each other's sleep schedules and food preferences and the particular ways they each fell apart under pressure and then came back together. He thought about the Tuesday in March, 3 years ago, when she'd called him from a hospital waiting room, voice steady with enormous effort, telling him her mother was gone, and how he'd driven 90 miles in the rain to be there when she walked out of the building. He had built something with this woman, and she had destroyed it in 7 words, in a room full of people, while wearing the dress he'd bought her. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Sarah. He answered because Sarah was not someone he could keep at arm's length when she'd decided to reach him. "Where are you?" she said, without preamble. "Park. 2 blocks. Stay there." She arrived in 4 minutes, still carrying her glass of sparkling water, which struck him as both absurd and deeply characteristic. She sat beside him on the bench and looked at the dark trees in front of them and said nothing for a long moment. "I want to tell you something," she said finally, "and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." "I'm not sure I can hear anything right now, Sarah." "I know. Try anyway." She turned to face him. In the amber light from the nearest lamppost, her expression was careful and precise in the way her best scientific thinking always was. "Who do you think Priya's ex is?" He stared at her. "What kind of question is that?" "Humour me." "I assumed, the texts, someone named Eli." "Dominic." Sarah paused. "Eli is short for Ileana." He felt the sentence arrive without fully understanding its implications, the way you look at an optical illusion and see one image before the other one surfaces, and then you cannot unsee it. "Eliana," he repeated. "Naira's full name," Sarah said quietly, "is Ileana Naira Vasquez. She goes by Naira. She always has. But 6 years ago, when she and Priya were together, Priya called her Eli." The park was very still. Something inside Dominic shifted, not healed, not resolved, but rearranged. The picture he'd been looking at for 43 days was the same picture. The pieces hadn't changed. He'd simply been reading the shapes wrong. "Priya wasn't cheating on you," Sarah said. "She was hiding something, yes, but not what you thought. She and Naira." From what I could piece together in the last 45 minutes, they dated seriously for 2 years before Priya met you. Priya never fully told you about it, and Naira came back into her life about 6 weeks ago. She paused. "Not to start something new. From what Priya told me just now, and she's devastated that you walked out, by the way. She tried to explain, but everyone was watching. Naira came back because she's in crisis, a mental health breakdown. Priya has been helping her, quietly, in the only way she knew how, which was badly." Dominic sat very still. "The secrecy," he said slowly, "the late texts, She didn't know how to tell you that she'd been hiding a significant relationship from your entire marriage. The past and the present arrived at the same door at the same time, and she panicked." Sarah's voice was gentle, but it didn't soften the edges of what she was saying. "None of that excuse is not being honest with you. She should have told you. She knows that. But what was happening wasn't what you thought was happening." He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes. The confession in the living room rearranged itself in his mind. "Yes, I'm with my ex." Not a declaration of an affair. An answer, and he now understood to what question. In a room where Naira had apparently pushed beyond what could be contained, had said something that required Priya to finally, publicly, irrevocably stop hiding. He had heard the words and built the only story he knew to build. He'd been wrong. He'd also walked out without letting her finish. When he returned to the house, most of the guests had left. The ones who remained, Sarah, Zara and Marcus, Chen Wei and Reed, sat in the living room with the quiet solidarity of people who've decided, wordlessly, that someone shouldn't be alone. Priya was in the kitchen. She was washing dishes with the same mechanical focus he'd used to set down a glass, the small tasks that hold you together when nothing else will. She heard him come in and went still with her hands in the water, not turning around. "The neighbors probably heard," he said. It wasn't what he'd intended to say. He wasn't sure what he'd intended to say. She turned around then. Her eyes were red. The pinned-up hair had come loose on one side, and she hadn't fixed it. "I should have told you," she said, "about Eli, about all of it, from the beginning." She wiped her hands on a dish towel slowly. "I was ashamed, not of her, of the hiding. Every year that passed made it harder to say. It became this thing I'd buried so deep that talking about it felt like excavating something that would destabilize everything." She looked at him. "And then she called me in September. She was in a very bad place, Dominic. A genuinely dangerous place. And I couldn't turn that off. I couldn't say that was 6 years ago, so it's not my problem anymore." He leaned against the doorframe. "You should have told me," he said. "I know. 6 weeks ago, or 6 years ago, you should have told me." "I know." Her voice didn't break. It stayed even, which somehow made it worse. "I thought—" He stopped. "For 43 days, I thought you were—" "I know what you thought." She put the dish towel down on the counter. "I saw it. I didn't know how to correct it without opening everything else, and that was cowardice. I know that too." The kitchen was quiet, except for the sound of the dishwasher running through its cycle. Lyra, their tabby cat, indifferent to human catastrophe, padded in from the hallway and wound herself around Dominic's ankles with the absolute conviction of someone who had not been fed recently enough and wished to register a formal complaint. He looked down at the cat. He looked at his wife. "Is she okay?" he asked. "Naira." Priya blinked. Something shifted in her expression, surprise, and then something that looked, very faintly, like the beginning of relief. "She's with her sister now. She started seeing someone last week. A therapist, I mean. It took a long time to get her there." She paused. "Tonight wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to come. She showed up because—" She exhaled. "It doesn't matter why. She came and I should have handled it differently." "You should have handled the whole thing differently," Dominic said. "Not cruelly, just clearly." "Yes." He crossed the kitchen and picked up the dish towel she'd set down and folded it absently, the thing his hands reached for, the small mechanical comfort, and stood beside her at the counter. "I don't know how we're supposed to start from here," he said. "Neither do I." She didn't reach for him. She stood close enough that he could see the mascara she hadn't fully cried off, the fine lines at the corners of her eyes that had deepened over their years together. "But I want to, if you do." He thought about 43 nights of ceiling staring. He thought about the weight of a suspicion you carry alone because you're afraid of what answering it might cost you. He thought about how they'd been doing the same thing, both of them, orbiting a secret in opposite directions and colliding tonight in the middle of their living room in front of 22 people who were now, doubtless, revising the entire story. "We have to actually talk," he said. "Not around things, about them." "Yes." "The whole history, the real one." "Yes," she said again, quieter. He put the folded dish towel back on the counter. Lyra meowed pointedly from somewhere near her bowl. "Tomorrow," he said. "All of it." Priya nodded. Her hand moved slightly toward him and then stopped, not withdrawn, just waiting. He covered it with his own, In the living room, Sarah was telling Chen Wei something about neural pattern recognition, the way she always filled silence with science when the emotional weather was too complex to narrate. Reed had, unsurprisingly, taken out his camera and was now photographing the half-empty wine glasses on the coffee table with the serene focus of a man who understood that the most honest documentaries were always about the aftermath. Zara caught Dominic's eye when he appeared in the doorway and gave him a look that managed, somehow, to contain both. "Are you okay? And I'm not going to ask you that out loud right now in a single glance." He gave her a small nod that he hoped communicated something similar in return. Marcus was asleep on the sofa, which was simply who Marcus was at parties. The room looked the way rooms look after something real has happened in them. Slightly rearranged, the furniture the same but the air different, as if the walls have absorbed the event and are still processing it. Dominic sat in the armchair nearest the window. Through the glass, he could see the street outside. The same street he'd walked down less than an hour ago with the specific kind of certainty that sometimes passes for grief. The streetlights were the same. The parked cars were the same. The neighbors' Halloween decorations blinked their steady, seasonal rhythm. Everything looked exactly as it had. Which was the strange part about the rearrangement of a story. Nothing changed shape. Only the meaning of the shapes shifted. "I'm with my ex." He'd heard betrayal. The room had heard betrayal. He'd walked out and closed the door softly and sat on a park bench and built a whole architecture of grief on a foundation that turned out to be something else entirely. He wasn't naive enough to call this a happy ending. There was still the matter of 6 years of incompleteness. There was still the 43 nights and the text messages and the way Priya had let him carry a fear she could have relieved with 3 sentences of honesty. There was still the fact that trust, once examined under the particular light of suspicion, does not simply return to its original shape. But there was also this, the warm weight of her hand beneath his, still there when he'd placed his own over it. There was also this, she'd been helping someone in crisis, quietly, badly, at the cost of her own peace and his, but she'd been helping. The woman he'd married was intact inside the mystery he'd been trying to solve. That wasn't nothing. Later, much later, after Sarah had kissed them both on the cheek and whispered "call me tomorrow" to Dominic specifically, after Zara and Marcus had finally extracted themselves, Marcus still half asleep, after Chen Wei had made them both tea without asking whether they wanted it and left it on the kitchen counter with the quiet authority of a man who has navigated enough human catastrophe to know that tea is always the right answer, after Reed had, incredibly, asked if he could use tonight as the opening scene of a documentary he was developing and been told, gently but clearly, no. After all of that, the house was quiet and empty and entirely theirs again. Priya sat on the couch. Dominic sat in the armchair. Lyra had claimed the warm space between them on the cushion, which seemed, to Dominic, less like feline indifference and more like a territorial negotiation he was willing to accept. "There's a lot I haven't said," Priya said. "I know. I don't know where to start." He looked at her, really looked, the way he'd been trying and failing to do for 6 weeks, through the static of his own fear. She looked tired. She looked relieved. She looked like someone standing at the beginning of something difficult and not yet sure she had the strength for it. "Start at the beginning," he said. "We have time." Outside, the city moved through its late-night rhythms, a car passing, the distant modulation of someone's music, the ordinary mechanical pulse of a place full of people living their complicated, hidden, layered lives. Inside the house on the quiet street, 2 people who had spent 43 days circling a secret from opposite directions sat in the aftermath of a party that had gone wrong and right in almost equal measure and began, slowly, imperfectly, with all the difficulty that honesty requires after a long silence, to tell each other the truth. It wasn't the ending either of them had pictured when the night began. But it was, possibly, the one they needed. End.